Healers, shamans, witch doctors and crystal balls have a particular place in Middle Eastern culture. Yet Saudi regime's elite's crystal ball seems to be broken, particularly when it comes to their predictions about the future of Syria.
It could take 6 months, it could take 3 months, it could take 3 years. But the situation in Syria will come to an end and there will be no Bashar al-Assad in it. The choice that we've always said is twofold. One option is to end it through a political process, or it will be ended through a military conflict. Bashar al-Assad will leave by a date certain. It can't be probable, it can't be possible, it has to be certain. He will go. There is no doubt about it, he will go. He will go either through a political process or he will be removed by force. There is no doubt that he will go.
What is your assessment of the strength of Bashar Assad now, given the 3.5 months of Russian airstrikes that have supported him?
I believe Bashar al-Assad is weak, and I believe Bashar al-Assad is finished, and I believe Bashar al-Assad has no future in Syria.
After almost 4 years, Takfiri terrorism in Syria and Iraq has lost almost all major footholds, marking a crucial juncture in the region's war on terror, while morphing the geopolitics of the Middle East. Back in 2011, and just months after unrests in Syria began to spread, it was the Saudi regime which pushed the Arab League to unveil the so-called roadmap to settle what it called the Syrian crisis. Riyadh could convince the Arab League members to take a harsh stance against Damascus. Flash forward 2019. The ambassadors of the regimes which were ready to pay any cost to topple the Syrian legitimate government are now disappointedly talking of reopening their embassies in Damascus. Just at the eve of 2019, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir visited Damascus as the first visit by the leader of an Arab League state since 2011. That was followed by the UAE regime's decision to open its embassy in Syria, with a charge d'affaires assuming duties. Bahrain was another Arab regime announcing that work is continuing at its embassy in Damascus. After almost 8 years since the expulsion of Syria from the Arab League, it seems now that there is an increasing consensus among the League's members that Syria should be readmitted.
عودة دولة الإمارات العربية بفتح سفارتها، تشرفنا برفع العلم الإماراتي اليوم في داخل سوريا، في داخل دمشق، والحقيقة بكل فرح وسرور حضرنا هذه المناسبة، وهذه دعوة لكافة الدول العربية أن تعيد النظر بعلاقاتها مع سوريا وتعيد فتح سفاراتها في دمشق. سوريا بلد محوري، بلد مهم للعرب، ولا يمكن نسيانه من قبل العرب.
All Saudi hostile political maneuvers against Damascus are now winding down to Riyadh's disappointment.
Now that the Saudis are at the losing end of this war, there's a scramble for amongst all of the Gulf monarchies, and particularly Saudi Arabia, to try and reclaim some sort of influence in the region. So you may have seen that there's been a reopening of the Emirates embassy in Damascus, and Kuwait also. Most of these Gulf monarchies, with the exception of Oman, were involved in funding terrorist groups in Syria. So there's a big turnaround happening at the moment.
But Saudi's antagonistic demeanors against the nation of Syria was not simply restricted to the international organizations. In the dark corners of the Saudi palace's courts, regime change in Syria was drawn as the main political regional landscape, leaving no moral and ethical limits for the House of Saud in dealing with Syria. Terrorists must have flooded the turmoil country, plunging it even further into the chaos. But if you think Saudi's big bloody plan for Syria was drawn after Syrian political turmoil, you should think again. It is now evident that the Saudi regime's malicious plans in the Middle East region go well back to over a decade ago. A speech between the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, Sir Richard Dialov, and Prince Bandar, the former head of Saudi intelligence, was particularly a revealing and ominous dialogue between the two heads of spying apparatuses. Many were perplexed and horrified by the violent news and footage being broadcast from occupied lands by terrorists in Syria for years. However, it was quite evident that Takfiri and militant terrorism in Syria enjoying the Saudi regime's full backing could not be understood if the history of Saudi Arabia and its formal religion, Wahhabism, were not put in perspective. A cursory review of the terrorists' atrocities inside Syria could be easily traced back into the hot sands of Saudi Arabia.
Well, the Saudis backed a large number of the jihadist groups in Syria, the foreign ones and the Syrian ones. They were the major funders of Jaish al-Islam, which was based in East Ghouta, for example, and most of the foreign fighters for Jabhat al-Nusra, which was supporting Jaish al-Islam, were Saudis. They were behind the terrorist attacks in Iraq more than 10 years ago. The movement of Daesh to Syria, to eastern Syria in particular, was essentially a creation of the Saudis, which bought weapons from the US and funneled weapons to those terrorist groups in Syria.
The tectonic plates in Syria are now rapidly moving into different directions, and the phenomenon is already felt across the globe. As the Syrian establishment, along with its allies, are joining the public to rejoice the victory, the Saudi regime is hurried to make up with the situation, keeping its last footholds inside the Syrian territory. Syria is now close to scoring a major diplomatic victory after years of chaos.
The important thing about the Syrian president is that Syrians have shown very strong support for him all through the conflict. I think, if anything, and we know this from the polls and the surveys of his opponents, not just the Syrian elections and the Syrian polls, but we know that NATO, and we know that polls carried out by Qatar, and we know that the statements of the jihadist leaders in Aleppo, when they held part of Aleppo, they recognised that the population didn't support those sectarian groups, and that there was very strong support for the Syrian army and for the Syrian president, despite the fact that there's still a great deal of scepticism about the government and perhaps the Ba'ath Party, but the Syrian army is extremely popular in Syria, and the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad is extremely popular in Syria. It was quite obvious, even to the foreign press that were anti-Syrian at the time of the presidential elections in 2014, that Syrians inside and outside the country expressed very strong support for the president.
In contrast, the House of Saud is now tasting the bitter taste of failure. Saudis miscalculated in Syria, and the sand is rapidly running down if they don't change their traditional regional diplomatic track.